The subway car was packed, as it often was during the evening rush hour. The faint hum of the train echoed against the walls, mixing with the muffled chatter of passengers and the occasional screech of metal on metal. Among the crowd, people clung to the overhead rails or balanced themselves with weary expressions, counting down the stops until they could escape the chaos and head home. For most, it was just another day, a routine commute. But for one man, what happened during this ride would change everything. Squeezed into the corner of the car was a young woman, visibly pregnant, her hands gently resting on her rounded belly as she swayed with the rhythm of the train. Her face was calm but tired, the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from just one day, but from carrying the weight of both her body and the world's assumptions. She scanned the seats, hopeful for a small act of kindness, a gesture of understanding in an otherwise indifferent crowd. Nearby, a middle-aged man sat rigidly in his seat, arms crossed, his expression stern. He was dressed sharply, polished shoes, a crisp suit, and a leather briefcase resting on his lap. The way he held himself radiated authority or perhaps arrogance. His eyes briefly met hers, acknowledging her standing just a few feet away. But instead of offering his seat, he turned his gaze to his phone, scrolling with deliberate indifference. The tension in the air was palpable. A few passengers noticed the silent exchange, their eyes darting between the man and the woman. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to get involved. Others whispered among themselves, their disapproval evident but muted. Still, no one spoke up. The pregnant woman shifted her weight, gripping the rail tighter as the train jolted suddenly. Her balance wavered for a moment, and she let out a small gasp as she steadied herself. A few gasps echoed through the car, but still, the man in the suit remained seated, unmoving. What no one realized, least of all the man, was that someone was watching, a figure sitting quietly a few rows away, observing every detail with an expression that was unreadable but deeply intent. They hadn't spoken up yet, but they were taking it all in. The man's dismissive attitude, the woman's silent struggle, and the crowd's hesitance to act. The train rattled on, stop after stop, the air growing heavier with every passing moment. The scene had become a silent drama, a moral test that everyone in the car seemed to fail by their inaction. And yet, the stranger kept watching, their presence unnoticed, their thoughts unreadable. Just when it seemed like nothing would change, that this quiet injustice would play out like so many others, the stranger stood up. The man in the suit barely noticed, at least not yet. But what happened next would leave the entire subway car stunned. Stay tuned to find out how one small act turned into a lesson no one on that train would ever forget. The stranger rose slowly, their movements deliberate yet unnoticed by most of the passengers. The train continued to rattle along the tracks, the sound filling the silence that had settled over the tense scene. The man in the suit remained absorbed in his phone, oblivious to the shift in energy around him. The pregnant woman kept her grip tight on the rail, adjusting her posture as she swayed slightly with the train's motion. She hadn't said a word, not a single request, not a single complaint. But her eyes held a quiet exhaustion, one that told a deeper story than words ever could. The stranger, a tall figure in a simple but well-fitted coat, took a step forward, their gaze fixed on the man in the suit. There was something unreadable in their expression. Not anger, not impatience, but something far more unsettling. It was the kind of quiet observation that made people uneasy without knowing why. More passengers started to take notice. A young man sitting nearby glanced up from his earbuds, sensing the change in atmosphere. An older woman clutching her grocery bag shifted in her seat, her eyes flickering between the pregnant woman and the man in the suit. It was subtle, but the tension was thick enough to be felt by those who were paying attention. Still, no one said anything. The train jerked suddenly as it slowed for the next stop, causing the pregnant woman to lose her balance slightly. She caught herself just in time, but her breath hitched in her throat. A few people flinched, their hands instinctively moving as if they wanted to help but hesitated. And still, the man in the suit didn't look up. The stranger took another step forward, this time making sure their presence was felt. The movement was slight, but deliberate. The man in the suit finally noticed, sensing someone standing near him. He glanced up, his eyes meeting the stranger's for the first time. There was a brief flicker of something in his expression, annoyance, maybe defensiveness. But he masked it quickly, his face hardening into a neutral look as he turned his attention back to his phone. The stranger didn't move away. The silence stretched on. The train's doors opened, and a few passengers shuffled off, their footsteps echoing against the platform. A couple of new riders stepped in, but the focus remained on the unspoken standoff. Then, finally, the stranger spoke. "Excuse me." The words were calm, measured. Not a demand, not a plea, just a statement. The man in the suit barely acknowledged it. His eyes flickered up for a split second before returning to his phone. He adjusted his grip on his briefcase, his posture stiff. It was clear he had no intention of responding. The stranger didn't move. They didn't press further. They simply stood there, waiting. The silence became deafening. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man in a hoodie near the door raised an eyebrow, clearly interested in where this was going. The young woman with the earbuds had pulled one out, pretending to scroll through her phone, but very much listening. The pregnant woman, still standing just a few feet away, watched the exchange quietly. She didn't seem surprised. If anything, she looked as if she had seen this play out before, many times in many ways. The train lurched forward again, speeding toward the next stop. The air inside the subway car felt heavier, charged with something unsaid, something waiting to unfold. The stranger didn't repeat themselves. They didn't need to. Their presence alone spoke volumes. And for the first time, the man in the suit seemed to feel it. He shifted slightly, adjusting his position, his fingers tightening around his phone. His eyes flickered around the car, as if finally realizing just how many people were paying attention. But instead of looking apologetic, he looked irritated, frustrated that he was being challenged in such a subtle yet undeniable way. He exhaled sharply, clearly annoyed, but still didn't move. A few seconds passed, but they felt longer. Then, another voice broke the silence. "Man, just let her sit." It came from a young guy in the hoodie near the door. His tone was casual but firm, the kind of tone that wasn't looking for an argument, just calling out what needed to be said. A murmur of agreement rippled through the car. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A shifting of weight, a glance exchanged between strangers, small gestures, but they carried meaning. The man in the suit's jaw tightened. He glanced around again, as if realizing he was outnumbered. His fingers tapped against his phone screen, as if debating whether to respond. And then, finally, he spoke. She didn't ask. He muttered, his voice low but sharp. The words landed heavily. The pregnant woman didn't flinch. She simply let out a soft breath, looking away as if she had heard that exact excuse before, too many times to count. The stranger, however, didn't look away. They held their gaze on the man in the suit, their expression unreadable. Not angry, not impatient, just steady. The train continued racing forward. The next stop was approaching. The air inside the car was thick with something unresolved. The stranger took one final step forward, standing so close now that the man in the suit couldn't ignore them. And then, in a voice just as calm as before, they said something that made the entire subway car go silent. The man in the suit looked up sharply, his expression shifting. But before he could respond, the train doors slid open. And in that brief moment, everything changed. The train doors slid open with a soft chime, but no one moved. The usual shuffle of passengers getting on and off was strangely absent. It was as if time had slowed for just a moment, the tension inside the subway car pressing down like an invisible weight. The man in the suit hesitated. His fingers hovered over his phone screen, his body tensed as if preparing to defend himself. His expression was carefully controlled, but there was something underneath it, something unsettled. The stranger's words still hung in the air. Whatever they had said, it had struck a nerve. Passengers who had been watching from the sidelines leaned in just a little, waiting to see what would happen next. The young man in the hoodie near the door crossed his arms, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth as if daring the man in the suit to say something else. The older woman with the grocery bag pursed her lips, shaking her head slightly. The pregnant woman remained silent. She wasn't looking at the man anymore. Instead, her gaze was fixed on the stranger, her expression unreadable. The doors beeped once, twice. They were about to close. For a moment, it seemed like the man in the suit might stand up. His posture shifted just slightly, his grip tightening on his briefcase. His eyes flickered toward the stranger, then back to his phone, then toward the woman still standing just a few feet away. Then just as quickly, his body stiffened. Without a word, he leaned back into his seat and crossed his arms over his chest. The doors slid shut. The train lurched forward again. A few people scoffed under their breath. Someone let out a small sigh of disappointment. But no one said anything loud enough to be a direct challenge. The stranger, however, didn't move away. They remained standing, still facing the man in the suit, their presence unwavering. The subway car continued its rhythmic motion, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering slightly as the train moved through the tunnels. The sound of the wheels against the tracks filled the silence, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of a newspaper or the soft chime of a phone notification. The man in the suit shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced up again, his expression somewhere between frustration and defiance. "What?" he finally muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the stranger to hear. The stranger tilted their head slightly, studying him. The man in the suit let out a sharp exhale. "She didn't ask," he repeated, his tone firmer this time, as if saying it again would make it more justifiable. "I'm not a mind reader." The young man in the hoodie let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Man, come on. You saw her. Everybody saw her." The man in the suit's jaw tightened. Maybe she didn't want to sit. The pregnant woman finally spoke. "I do," she said softly. The entire car went silent again. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. She wasn't pleading, wasn't begging. She was simply stating a fact. The man in the suit turned toward her slightly, as if seeing her for the first time. His mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, something flickered across his face, something uncertain, something human. But just as quickly, it was gone. He let out a small, dismissive scoff and shook his head. "There are other seats," he muttered, gesturing vaguely around the car. The problem was, there weren't. Every seat was occupied, and now, more passengers were paying attention. Eyes were locked onto him from all directions. The older woman with the grocery bag let out a quiet TSK, shaking her head. A businessman near the back frowned at the scene unfolding in front of him. Even a teenager glued to their phone had paused, their fingers hovering over the screen as they listened in. The stranger took another step forward. This time, the man in the suit flinched. "You saw her," the stranger said quietly. Their voice wasn't angry. It wasn't raised. But there was something in it, something final. The man in the suit clenched his jaw. His fingers tapped against his phone again, as if searching for an escape. The train rattled forward, the next stop approaching. Another moment stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. Then, suddenly, the man in the suit stood up. For a split second, it seemed like he might finally do the right thing. But instead of offering his seat, he grabbed his briefcase and stepped toward the doors, muttering something under his breath. A few passengers scoffed. Someone shook their head in disbelief. The pregnant woman didn't react. She simply exhaled quietly, shifting her weight again to keep her balance. The train slowed as it approached the next stop. The stranger watched as the man in the suit positioned himself near the doors, his back stiff, his expression unreadable. And then, just before the train came to a complete stop, the stranger did something no one expected. They turned toward the pregnant woman, and without a word, they gently guided her toward their own seat. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting theirs. There was something kind in the stranger's face, something patient, something steady. Then, finally, she nodded and sat down. A few people murmured in quiet approval. The doors slid open. The man in the suit stepped off the train without looking back. The subway car remained silent for a long moment as the doors slid shut behind him. Then, slowly, the train pulled away from the platform. The young man in the hoodie shook his head again, muttering, "Some people, man." The older woman with the grocery bag sighed. You see it all in this city. The stranger didn't say anything. They simply remained standing, holding onto the rail as the train continued forward, the sound of the tracks filling the space where words had been left unspoken. The pregnant woman adjusted in her seat, resting a hand on her belly. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The subway car carried on, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks filling the heavy silence left behind. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, but the air still held the weight of what had just happened. People exchanged glances, some in quiet approval, others in discomfort, as if witnessing something they wished they could forget. The pregnant woman sat still, her hands resting on her belly, her breathing steady but deep. She didn't look around, didn't acknowledge the man who had just stormed off. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. It probably wouldn't be the last. The stranger remained standing, gripping the rail lightly, their expression unreadable. Their presence still carried weight, even as the tension slowly began to fade. The young man in the hoodie nodded at them, a subtle gesture of respect, before returning his attention to his phone. The older woman with the grocery bag let out a small sigh, shaking her head to herself. But just when it seemed like things were settling, a shift in energy rippled through the car. A few seats down, a man in a dark jacket cleared his throat loudly. His eyes flickered toward the stranger, then toward the pregnant woman, then back again. His expression wasn't one of approval. It was something else. Something harder, colder. People love to make a scene, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be heard. A few heads turned. Some people immediately looked away, unwilling to be pulled into whatever this was. Others tensed, bracing for what might come next. The young man in the hoodie furrowed his brow, pulling his earbuds out completely now. You got something to say, man? He asked, his voice casual but edged with warning. The man in the dark jacket smirked, leaning back in his seat. Just saying, he continued, his voice slow, deliberate. People jump to conclusions real fast these days. Not like she asked. Some folks just love to play the victim. A low murmur of disapproval moved through the car. The pregnant woman's grip on her belly tightened, her knuckles turning white. But she didn't speak. The stranger, however, turned their head slightly, their gaze settling on the man in the dark jacket. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension began to coil again, tighter this time, sharper. The young man in the hoodie let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Oh yeah, real victim mentality, he said, sarcasm dripping from every word. You think standing for a pregnant woman is some kind of oppression now. The man in the dark jacket smirked again, but it was thinner now, forced. I just think people get too sensitive about everything these days, he said, shrugging. Dude didn't want to give up his seat. So what? Not a crime. A muscle twitched in the stranger's jaw. The older woman with the grocery bag scoffed under her breath, clearly having had enough. Basic decency isn't a crime either, she muttered. A few other passengers nodded in agreement. Someone else let out a quiet exactly. The man in the dark jacket glanced around, as if realizing he wasn't going to get much support. His smirk faltered for half a second, but then he straightened in his seat, letting out a slow exhale through his nose. He looked at the stranger again, eyes narrowing slightly, as if sizing them up. You look real comfortable playing the hero, he said, his voice lower now. Bet you feel real proud of yourself, huh? The subway car seemed to shrink. The space between them felt smaller, the air charged. The stranger didn't answer right away. Instead, they studied him for a long moment. The train rumbled on, the next stop approaching fast. Then, finally, the stranger spoke. Not about pride, they said quietly. It's about seeing people. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the noise like a knife. The man in the dark jacket's smirk twitched, as if the response had caught him off guard. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to argue, but then the train suddenly jolted as it began slowing down. The motion was sharper than usual, rougher. The lights flickered once, just for a second. A metallic groan echoed through the car as the brakes engaged, the train dragging itself toward the next station. The moment broke. People shifted in their seats, some gripping the rails a little tighter. The man in the dark jacket exhaled through his nose again, shaking his head as if dismissing the conversation. He didn't say anything else, just leaned back in his seat and turned his gaze toward the window, watching as the platform came into view. The stranger's expression remained unreadable. The pregnant woman glanced up at them, a question in her eyes, but before she could speak, the doors slid open. A new wave of passengers entered, disrupting the charged atmosphere. More people filled the car, some standing, some squeezing into newly emptied seats. Conversations shifted, new voices blending into the hum of the subway. But those who had been there from the start hadn't forgotten. The man in the dark jacket kept his gaze fixed on the window, but his jaw was tight, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. The young man in the hoodie was still watching, still listening, waiting to see if anything else would happen. The pregnant woman adjusted her posture slightly, letting out a slow breath as the train doors slid shut again. And the stranger, still standing, still gripping the rail, turned their gaze toward the far end of the subway car, where, unnoticed by most, the man in the suit who had left earlier was now standing on the platform outside, watching. And this time, he wasn't looking at his phone. The train pulled away from the platform, but the stranger's eyes lingered on the man in the suit outside. His expression was different now, not one of irritation or detachment, but something else, something unreadable. He wasn't scrolling through his phone anymore. He wasn't rushing off like someone who had simply left to avoid confrontation. No, he was standing still, his gaze locked onto the subway car as it disappeared into the tunnel. Something about it sent a chill down the stranger's spine. The energy in the train had shifted again. The murmurs of conversation, the rustling of coats, the hum of the moving car, it all felt like background noise to something bigger brewing just beneath the surface. The young man in the hoodie must have felt it too, because he glanced at the stranger, raising an eyebrow. "That dude still out there?" he asked, voice low. The stranger gave a small nod. The pregnant woman, quiet until now, exhaled slowly. Her fingers brushed over the curve of her belly. "He was watching?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The young man let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Man, that guy has some nerve." He shook his head, eyes narrowing. "What do you think he's up to?" No one had an answer. The stranger looked down at their own hands, gripping the rail a little tighter. The man in the suit had seemed ready to let go of the whole situation, annoyed, embarrassed, but not particularly interested in dragging it out. And yet there he was, standing outside the train, watching. It didn't make sense. The train rumbled forward, the next station still minutes away. The subway car wasn't as crowded as before, but there were enough people packed in that movement was limited. It made everything feel just a little more confined, a little more tense. Then something shifted again. It started with a feeling, a weight in the air, a quiet ripple of unease that passed between passengers like an unspoken warning. The young man in the hoodie tensed. The older woman with the grocery bag glanced around, frowning slightly. Even the pregnant woman, who had been steady this whole time, suddenly looked more alert. And then, without warning, the train's lights flickered. Once, twice. A sharp jolt rocked the car as the train braked harder than usual, nearly knocking some of the standing passengers off balance. A few people let out surprised gasps. Someone grabbed onto a pole at the last second, their bag swinging into the person beside them. The subway wasn't supposed to stop here. The train groaned as it came to a full stop in the middle of the tunnel. The lights flickered again, then dimmed to a low, humming glow. The air felt heavier now, charged with a tension no one could quite place. A crackle from the overhead speakers made people look up, waiting for an announcement. But there was nothing, just static, then silence. The pregnant woman let out a slow breath. "This isn't normal, right?" she asked, her voice calm but wary. The older woman shook her head. "Not at all." The stranger turned toward the young man in the hoodie, who was already checking his phone. He swiped at the screen, tapping at the top corner. Then he frowned. "No service," he muttered. "That's weird. I usually get at least a bar, even in the tunnels." A few others checked their phones too. Someone groaned in frustration. "Same." Nothing. The train remained still. No sound from the intercom, no explanations. Just the dim overhead lights and the murmur of confused passengers. Then, from the far end of the car, someone cursed under their breath. "You've got to be kidding me," a man muttered. The stranger turned. And there, standing at the opposite end of the subway car, just inside the last set of doors, was the man in the suit. He hadn't gotten off. He had boarded again, unnoticed, at the last station. And now he was just standing there, watching. The young man in the hoodie stiffened beside the stranger. "You have got to be joking," he whispered. The pregnant woman's grip on her belly tightened. No one spoke. The man in the suit didn't move. His posture was casual, almost too casual. One hand in his pocket, the other gripping his briefcase. But his eyes never left the same spot. He was staring at the stranger. Another shift in the subway car. A ripple of realization. People who had witnessed the earlier exchange started whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between the man in the suit and the others. The older woman sighed heavily. "Oh, for heaven's sake." The young man in the hoodie took a small step forward, placing himself slightly in front of the pregnant woman. His hands clenched at his sides. "What do you want, man?" he asked, voice sharper this time. The man in the suit didn't answer right away. He exhaled through his nose, slow and deliberate. Then finally he spoke. "This train's taking longer than it should," he said simply. His voice was calm, too calm. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. The stranger's grip on the rail didn't loosen. "Why did you get back on?" they asked, their voice steady. The man in the suit tilted his head slightly. "Thought I forgot something," he said. Then he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Turns out I didn't." The subway car felt even smaller now, the air thicker. The young man let out a humorless laugh. "You came back just to be weird? That's real dedicated, bro." The man in the suit chuckled softly. "Oh, I think we're all stuck here for a bit anyway. Might as well get comfortable." The words fell off. Something about his tone sent a ripple of unease through the car. The way he spoke, the way he stood there, perfectly still, made the hairs on the back of the stranger's neck rise. A metallic groan echoed through the tunnel, the train shifting slightly on the tracks. The lights flickered again. Something wasn't right. The stranger glanced toward the pregnant woman. She was breathing slowly, deliberately. She wasn't panicked, but she was alert, waiting. The older woman clutched the strap of her bag a little tighter. The young man in the hoodie shifted his stance, as if ready for something, though he didn't know what. And the man in the suit? He just kept watching. The subway remained still. The tunnel stretched ahead, silent and dark. And deep down, everyone in that car knew, whatever was about to happen next, they weren't ready for it. A heavy silence settled over the subway car, thick with tension. The dim overhead lights cast long shadows on the faces of the passengers, their unease growing with every second the train remained still. The stranger tightened their grip on the rail, their eyes locked on the man in the suit. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken again, but his presence was enough to set every nerve on edge. The young man in the hoodie shifted his stance, angling himself slightly in front of the pregnant woman. His fingers twitched at his sides, his jaw tight. "All right, man," he said, voice steady but edged with irritation. "You're acting real weird, and we don't have time for it. What's your deal?" The man in the suit didn't respond right away. He just tilted his head slightly, as if studying them all. Then, slowly, he let out a soft chuckle. "You all look so nervous," he murmured. No one laughed. The pregnant woman exhaled, slow and measured. "If you have something to say, just say it," she said, her voice calm but firm. The man in the suit's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened around the handle of his briefcase. And then, without warning, the train jolted forward. The sudden movement sent a few standing passengers stumbling. Someone yelped as they grabbed onto a pole, while another caught themselves against a seat. The lights flickered wildly, plunging the car into brief moments of darkness before snapping back to life. And in that flickering chaos, the stranger saw it. The man in the suit had moved. Not much, just a shift of weight, a slight opening of the briefcase in his hand. But it was enough. Enough to make their stomach drop. A rush of adrenaline hit all at once. The stranger acted on instinct, shoving forward just as the train jolted again. In the blur of motion, they grabbed at the briefcase, yanking it down before he could fully open it. The man in the suit stumbled back, his expression shifting for the first time. Shock, then something colder, darker. What the? The young man in the hoodie started, but he caught on fast. His eyes darted between the stranger and the man in the suit, his muscles tensing. The older woman gasped, moving further back, while the pregnant woman remained still, her breath slow but her eyes sharp. The briefcase had fallen to the floor, its contents partially exposed. Papers, yes, but something else, something tucked beneath them. A sleek black device, small but unmistakable. The stranger's heart pounded. "What is this?" they demanded. The man in the suit's expression hardened. His composure had cracked just slightly, but he wasn't panicked. If anything, he seemed calculated. "Careful," he murmured. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." The train jerked forward again, gaining speed now as it barreled through the tunnel. The lights stabilized, but the unease remained, heavier than before. The young man in the hoodie took a step closer. "You were about to pull something, weren't you?" The man in the suit said nothing. The tension in the car was unbearable. A few passengers, those who hadn't been paying attention before, were now fully aware that something was wrong. They watched in silent horror, waiting for something to happen. Then the intercom crackled. A voice, distorted but audible. "Attention passengers, due to an unexpected delay, we will be stopping at the next station shortly. Please remain calm." The stranger glanced at the overhead speakers. The timing was convenient. Too convenient. The man in the suit slowly straightened, dusting off his sleeves as if nothing had happened. His composure returned, the mask slipping back into place. "Looks like our ride is almost over," he said smoothly. "Shame. I was enjoying the conversation." The train was moving faster now, the glow of an approaching station visible in the distance. The stranger didn't let their guard down. Neither did the young man in the hoodie. The pregnant woman spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "Who are you?" The man in the suit smiled. "Just someone paying attention." The train screeched as it began to slow, the lights flickering once more. Passengers braced themselves, gripping onto the rails and seats. The stranger's mind raced. There was no way they were letting him walk away without answers. But then, as the train finally came to a halt, something unexpected happened. The doors opened, and before anyone could react, the man in the suit turned and stepped off, vanishing into the crowd on the platform. The young man in the hoodie cursed under his breath, moving to follow, but the stranger grabbed his arm. "No," they said, their pulse still pounding. "Let him go." "But—" "He wanted to be seen," the stranger muttered, eyes still fixed on the disappearing figure. Whatever this was, it wasn't random. The pregnant woman exhaled, her hands still resting on her belly. "We need to report this." The older woman nodded in agreement, still clutching her grocery bag tightly. Other passengers, those who had witnessed the entire ordeal, murmured among themselves. Some were shaken, others confused. But one thing was clear, something had just happened, something bigger than any of them realized. The stranger bent down and picked up one of the fallen papers from the briefcase. There was no name, no clear identifying mark, just a single cryptic sentence typed across the page. "Some people see everything. Some people see nothing. Choose wisely." The stranger's breath caught. The train's intercom crackled again, but this time it was just static. And somewhere beyond the station, lost in the crowd, the man in the suit was still watching. The subway platform buzzed with life, but for those who had been in that train car, the world felt strangely quiet. The strangers still held the paper in their hands, the cryptic message pressing against their palm as if it carried weight beyond the ink on the page. The young man in the hoodie let out a frustrated breath, his eyes scanning the crowd as if he might spot the man in the suit slipping away. But he was gone, just like that. The pregnant woman placed a steadying hand on the metal pole near the train doors. She hadn't said much since stepping off, her gaze shifting between the stranger and the young man. She was thinking, processing. The older woman, the one with the grocery bag, let out a long sigh and shook her head. "I don't know what just happened," she muttered, "but that man wasn't normal." "Not at all." The stranger nodded, their thoughts racing. Who was he? Why had he gotten back on the train? Why had he watched them so closely? And most importantly, what had been in that briefcase? They had only caught a glimpse, but that glimpse had been enough to know something was off. The young man shoved his hands into his hoodie pocket, rocking back on his heels. "So, what do we do?" he asked. "Call the cops? Report him?" The pregnant woman looked up. "And say what?" Her voice was calm but firm. "That a well-dressed man got on the train, acted strange, and then left? That he had something in his briefcase, but we don't even know what it was." The young man hesitated, but he knew she was right. There wasn't much to report. No real crime. No clear threat. Just a gut feeling that something had been wrong. The older woman frowned. People like that, they don't just do things for no reason. She adjusted her grocery bag on her arm, shifting her weight. "I've seen enough in my life to know when someone is playing a game. And that man? He was playing a game with all of us." The stranger looked down at the paper in their hands again. The words burned into their mind. Some people see everything. Some people see nothing. Choose wisely. What was it supposed to mean? A warning? A test? The train behind them let out a mechanical sigh, the doors closing as it prepared to continue its journey. A few passengers lingered on the platform, still shaken by what had happened, whispering to each other. Others had already moved on, letting the moment slip away as just another odd city experience. But the stranger knew better. This wasn't something to just forget. The pregnant woman turned to them, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know why," she said, "but I think he wanted you to see that note." The stranger looked at her. "Why me?" She shrugged, but there was something knowing in her eyes. "Maybe because you were paying attention." The young man in the hoodie crossed his arms. "Okay, but paying attention to what? We still don't know what he wanted." The older woman exhaled. "Sometimes you don't find out right away." She glanced toward the crowd, then back at them. "But that doesn't mean you ignore it." A distant announcement echoed through the station, signaling the arrival of another train. The moment was slipping away, but the weight of what had happened lingered. The stranger folded the paper and slipped it into their pocket. It didn't answer anything, but it felt important to keep. The pregnant woman took a slow breath. "I should go. My stop is a few blocks away, and I need to get home." She looked at the stranger. "Thank you, by the way, for everything back there." The stranger nodded. "Of course." The young man clapped his hands together, exhaling. "Guess we just move on, huh?" The older woman gave a small, thoughtful smile. "We move on," she agreed, "but we don't forget." The group slowly parted ways, each carrying something unspoken with them. The young man headed toward the stairs, his hands still in his hoodie pocket. The older woman adjusted her bag and walked toward the nearest exit. The pregnant woman gave one last nod of appreciation before disappearing into the crowd. The stranger lingered. Their eyes drifted to the train tracks, then to the crowd. Somewhere out there, the man in the suit was still walking, blending into the world like nothing had happened. But something had happened, and whether it was meant as a warning, a test, or something else entirely, one thing was certain. The stranger had seen, and now they couldn't unsee it.